Today we're going to be talking about Proverbs 31, and I'm going to share with you a little bit of what I've been wrestling with in my Bible studies. And instead of going, word by word or verse by verse, I'm going to take it deeper, a high-level overview of what's going on and kind of like what we can pull or draw from this passage. Are familiar with the Proverbs 31 passage? I'd love to know what you think of this passage. What is it really talking about? And kind of what is the message that we should be taking away from it? And as we kind of walk through and dive through this kind of study, let me know if your thoughts have changed. Have you found anything interesting or new that you haven't thought of before? Is there something I may have missed or misunderstood? Please let me know in the comments so we can make this as interactive as possible. As you can see, I have studied this passage many times. Over here, I have my illustrated Bible. So this is the CSB translation, and I've kind of used that more to summarize my notes on this particular passage. And on this Bible, the ESV version, usually it's my reading Bible, but for this particular passage, I just kind of felt the need to just write and draw and make connections. So it's kind of all marked up, and it's a little hard to read and understand. So as we dive through this, I'll use a clean slate so that it's easier for us to kind of walk through and dissect it. But overall, I have spent a lot of time studying this passage over the years, and I've heard many, many sermons on this passage. I mean, I'm sure many of you have as well. It's very popular, especially around Mother's Day, or about talking about a wise woman, or about the kind of wife you should be or emulate. There are kind of a lot of cultural interpretations of this passage, but instead of diving into all of that and the history, we're going to try to do something a little bit different. In Proverbs 31, I think it's a very interesting passage because it is the concluding chapter of Proverbs, and this whole book is about wisdom and what it looks like to have wisdom in your life. What does it look like practically to have a life lived for God and a life filled with wisdom? So this is a very beneficial book for all believers to read, and I think everyone should read it. And this last passage is kind of the concluding chapter. And so for me, I consider it as the kind of summary of the whole book. So the words that are mentioned here are not by King Solomon. They're recorded by King Lemuel, and these are the words of his mother. I thought it was quite interesting. At the beginning of Proverbs, Proverbs 1:8, it says, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching." So it's kind of interesting how the bulk of Proverbs is the father's instructions. And at the end, this is kind of like the mother's teaching. So it's kind of wrapped up quite nicely in this package. And I want to share that with you today. Traditionally, I think a lot of people take verses 10 to 31 to speak about the worthy woman or a wise woman. But we kind of neglect the fact that there are verses 1 through 9 to go ahead of it. And to kind of put that in context, if you're going to consider 10 to 31 to be the wise woman, then verses 1 to 9 is basically talking about how to be a wise man or a wise ruler. So I have the opening of the beginning of Proverbs 31, and this is kind of the section about being a good and wise ruler. And there is a pattern to this. And I have listed it here. It says A, B, B. And you kind of flip over. And I kind of flipped it over, and verse 10 is A. So it's kind of a repeating of words and kind of a parallelism. Basically, I point that out so it can help us put this in context. So obviously in the first pattern, A, it has a command. It says, do not be led astray. Do not spend your energy on women, or do not give your strength to women. And that's something that this ruler should not do. But moving on down, if you want to complete the pattern, in verse 10, it says, who can find a wife of noble character? And if you dive into the Hebrew, it says, Eshet Hayil. So who can find a woman of valor or woman of strength? So it's a little bit of play on words in the beginning where it says, don't give your strength to women. And then who is this strong woman? For the second pattern, B, it says basically don't drink wine and don't have strong drink. Instead, this ruler should be giving those drinks to people that are dying or to the ones who are poor so that they could forget their troubles. So there is a time and a place for alcoholic drinks in this sense. It's not for the ruler because it tells you what happens. It says they will forget what they decree and remove from the poor their rights. So it's kind of telling you the consequences of not following this way. And in order to be wise, so it says instead for the ruler to speak up for those who have no voice, and also speak up, judge righteously, and defend the cause of the oppressed and the needy. So you can see in this pattern, this A, B, B, A pattern. First, don't give energy to women, or don't give your strength to women. Don't drink alcoholic beverages. Instead, you should do this with the alcoholic beverages so that you can do other things. And later on, it says this is kind of the woman of strength you should be searching for. So I think just understanding that structure helps keep this in context of the entire passage as a whole. Going through verses 10 to 31 is going to be our primary focus. I'm not going to go through individual word by word or verse by verse explanation, but rather a summary of kind of what's going on. So it really talks about this life of this woman and her accomplishments, her deeds, the things that happens, and ultimately her husband trusts her. She is praised, her children praise her, and kind of like everyone knows that she is this great person. Typically, I think most people have wondered, who is this woman? Is it an ideal that we need to aspire to? Is it Lady Wisdom? Or is it the woman that has been named the Eshet Hayil, the woman of valor, in the past? And the only other reference to this worthy woman is Ruth. And in the book of Ruth, it kind of details the life of this character, Ruth, and how eventually she has become a part of the line of Jesus. And Ruth is a very magnificent story of overcoming great desperation and also of great faith. Some claim that Proverbs 31 is kind of a tribute to her because she has embodied a lot of the qualities that are written in this text. You can dive into it in your own time. I think it's a really fascinating study if you want to do kind of a character study comparison between the woman that's depicted in Proverbs 31 and Ruth and the life of Ruth. And I have wrestled back and forth between who I think this woman should be. I have seen pros and cons for each, and I have done studies and seen kind of the parallels between all of the different situations and who this woman is. The thing is when we kind of focus on this woman and trying to understand who she is and try to pinpoint who she is and what she does and what she signifies, I think it misses the whole point of the passage. I think the conclusion of this passage really lays out what this passage is intended to tell us. So I'm going to read the last 2 verses of this passage. Charm is deceptive and beauty does not last, but a woman who fears the Lord will be greatly praised. Reward her for all she has done and let her deeds publicly declare her praise. Now, I think this is really the point, the summary, the concluding words of the entire book of Proverbs can kind of be summed up here. And this is what we really should be focusing on, is that a woman who fears the Lord will be greatly praised. And not only that, reward her for all that she has done. Let her deeds publicly declare her praise. Now, this is the NLT translation, and in other versions, there's different ways of explaining this passage, but I think this one really captures it well. And it really just shows us and focuses on not what she does, but who she is and kind of like her beliefs. The focus is not necessarily on all her accomplishments and the things she's done and how she's out in the world doing all these wonderful things. But at the heart of it all is that there is the fear of the Lord. And I think sometimes we don't understand what the fear of the Lord is, and we kind of like gloss over this verse and gloss over this passage. But it's really important because in Proverbs, that's basically what the entire book is about. You need to understand the fear of the Lord to understand the rest of the book. So we're going to go back to Proverbs 1:7. Fear of the Lord is the foundation of true knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. And basically, this is saying, you need to have faith as the basis for living wisely and living a life that God wants for you. And Proverbs kind of describes kind of the practical ways in which we can have this kind of godly wisdom. And we only get it is if we first have the fear of God. And the question always turns back to, well, what is the fear of God? What does that even mean? At the heart, it's very simple. It is revering God, understanding that He is full authority, and there is kind of that sense of reverence and respect and understanding that He is so great and we are so small in that kind of cosmic setting that it's almost overwhelming, right? That fear of God is not necessarily being afraid, although that can be a component. I think it's really just following, trusting, putting our whole lives and focusing on God. I mean, and this is the Old Testament, so I think the verbiage is a little bit different than what we're used to. And I think if we just move it to kind of the New Testament way of thinking, it's, drop everything, follow Christ. And it's kind of that similar concept, right? We point ourselves to Christ first, everything else will follow. And I think that's really what it's talking about. So if we can first trust and believe and follow Christ and follow God, everything else will follow. And this kind of ties into, your faith can be expressed through your works and through your actions. So to kind of put a link to the Old Testament and the New Testament, I would say it's best to kind of refer to James. So James is kind of like the New Testament version of Proverbs in a very abridged fashion. But in James 3:13, it says, "If you are wise and understand God's ways, prove it by living an honorable life, doing good works with the humility that comes from wisdom." And that is very, very similar to what is expressed in Proverbs 31. And so if you kind of study the book of James, you may realize that there are a lot of references to what is already written in Proverbs, and they kind of go hand in hand together. And so that's kind of the core message I get from Proverbs 31, is that you are to live your life for God. And your works should express that, from the outflow of your heart and from the outflow of your mouth, it expresses your faith and it shows your faith in a very practical, real life fashion. Oftentimes we kind of separate our lives, right? Like there's our work life and our Christian life. And, the people that we meet in both kind of settings and situations don't always meet and mesh well together. And that is something that I feel like is very uncommon in the book of Proverbs. We're not talking about, how you live your life working is different than how you live your life at home versus how you live your life at church, or how you express yourself in those spaces. In a sense, it's saying that all those things in all spheres of your life, they come together and they authentically match and mesh, and it shows your faith in every aspect of your life. In all that you do, you can reflect God. People can look at you and see the witness of God in that. And so that is kind of the ultimate message of Proverbs. So that's kind of my interpretation of this passage. If you have a different one, or if you think I'm totally off base, please let me know in the comment. I am just curious of what other people take away from this passage. So moving out of the kind of interpretation aspect, we're going into kind of the significance. So what is the significance? Like, now that I think, or I have interpreted that this passage is ultimately about, following God, and your actions will follow, and you will be rewarded for all those things. In Proverbs, it says kind of you will be rewarded by your family, your kids, and kind of your community. They will praise you for all that you have done. But I think we can take it a step further and see it in light of kind of an eternal aspect, right? That you will be rewarded for all you do by God in the future. When we're in heaven, you will see the fruit of all that you have done, and you will see the reward for all of that. You may not get rewarded now in the immediate sense, but you can be rewarded later as we go about our lives. Sometimes we get bogged down by life and think, oh, I've done all of these amazing things, or I've done so much. How come I'm not rewarded? How come I'm not blessed? And I think by taking the more eternal perspective of saying our blessings will come in the future, our blessings will come at a later date, really kind of gives us encouragement to know that, we are not being ignored, we're not being undervalued, and we're not being respected. And I think sometimes as women, all the things that we do are kind of unseen and kind of in the background and kind of expected. But when you don't do them, people will know. Like if you forget to do your laundry, people will know. If you forget to, pick up your kid, people will know. But rather, if you do all of those things right, you don't necessarily get a clap or pat on the back or say, that's great that you picked up your kid today. That's great that you did the laundry. I'm so thankful that my clothes are clean. Like we kind of miss that, and we need a little bit of validation. Just to know that God sees all and he will reward you in the future is great. And it's a good reminder for us. We can't always seek our rewards in earthly and human settings because it's not always going to be there and it will not fill us up. The other significant part of this is this passage really elevates women's work. Why is the concluding chapter talking about a woman? Not only just a woman, but what she can do in her everyday life. What does it look like in her day? And I think this is not necessarily about, a woman has to do all of these things. No, rather, this is a picture of what it could like in a specific woman's life, right? Like this person is very probably like, middle to upper class in this society. And she's also doing a lot of countercultural things, a lot of things that are not allowed in her current, in that society. And that is something that is prevalent is still relevant today. A woman's work should be elevated. And whatever we do should be praised and validated as well. There's not necessarily a boundary of what women can do. It doesn't say that women can only do these things. Rather, whatever we do, we have to do it with diligence. We have to do it with intention. And we have to actually seize opportunities. I think we got to look deeper to make those connections to say, this is not a woman who just sits and waits and wonders, okay, God, what am I supposed to do? Should I go here? Should I go there? Give me a sign. Instead, she sees things. She sees something is good, she goes for it. She sees something is beneficial to her family, she gets it. Like these are the type of things that God really wants for us. That is wisdom personified, is that we don't just sit and wait on the Lord. We take action, we do things based on the mind that God has given us, and we make wise decisions based on that. And that is kind of how practical wisdom looks like, right? Like, if you see a red light, you stop. Yes, everyone knows that that's something that we should do. It's good. It's beneficial to do. And I think that's just great to know that, whatever we do, we should do it with all our heart, and we should do it as if we're doing it for the Lord. I think Colossians 3:23 says something like that, and Matthew 5:16 says something similar, right? But people should look at our actions or see what we do, and instead of praising you directly, which is great, but that they should be praising God. And that's really what our focus is, right? By having people see us, they should see God, or a reflection of God. And that is really ultimately what our lives are about. So now we're going to push towards kind of an application mindset of this, is that based on what we know, based on what we've kind of absorbed from this passage and kind of mulling over those things, how can we apply it to our lives? And Proverbs is definitely the book where it talks about how do we apply things into our lives. Practical wisdom, godly living in the real world. Proverbs is not about, I got this great concept, this great idea, and I'm just going to think about it. No, it's actually about going out in your life, going out into your world, encountering real world situations and applying it in a positive manner and doing it in a way that is godly and doing it in a way that makes sense, right? In this faith perspective. In a sense, we always talk about, dying to ourselves, taking up our cross and dying to sin every day. But in Proverbs, it's kind of the opposite. It's like, how can we live for God every day? How can we be alive for God every day? And I think that is something to keep in mind, is that while we do need to focus on dying to our sins, dying to ourselves, we also need to focus on living for God, living for people, living for connection and relationships, and building that kind of community. Kind of the applications, I kind of take it into 3 sections, I want to say. I kind of narrow it down into like an in, out, up scenario, or head, heart, hands concept. These are just kind of frameworks that I use when I talk about application. So in is kind of dealing with, your own personal, wrestlings with your faith, and out is dealing with community and the world around us, and up is kind of your relationship with God, right? So you're just kind of working on understand this passage in these three kind of concepts and how you could apply that into your life. This passage is really telling us ultimately to love God, is to love your Lord, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, right? And not only that, it also showcases the second greatest commandment, which is to love your neighbor as yourself, right? There is that aspect of sharing in community, to help out the poor and the needy, and to reach out to those who can't help themselves, right? That is like a very big simplification of what the Bible is about, right? Love God, love people, and that's it. That's what the Bible is all about. But there's so much more that goes into it, right? When you unpack it, it has a lot more depth and meaning. This really causes me to think about being more intentional with my life, right? Being able to have all aspects of my life showcase that, I am a Christian and I believe in God, and this is how you know that I believe in God, right? Most of the time these days, you can't just walk into the street and look at somebody and be like, yeah, that person's a Christian and that one's not. It doesn't really work out that way. But I think as you get to know people and build relationships with people, you can really see God working in their lives. And it shows. It's a huge difference than some other people who don't have that and maybe don't believe in God at all. There's value in that. And you can see it in the wisdom, and you can also see it in, the blessings that God has provided for them. And it may not necessarily be material possessions that they have, but they are blessed in their outlook on life, the way that they view the world, the way they reach out to community. There are so many ways in which we can see how God is manifested in people's lives and that changes them. And I think it's not really what they do or say or whatnot, but it just emanates, right? And that's the goal, is that we should be reflections of God and of Christ in all that we do. And this passage really just talks about that. It may not talk about it as openly or as plainly in plain language, because it is a poetic passage, but I think ultimately that's kind of what it says. And I think I want you to be encouraged by that, because I think a lot of times we focus on, being this Proverbs 31 woman who can wake up early and sleep late, who can do and accomplish so many things. But, that's not the goal. The point is not to be able to wake up early or sleep late. The point is that we are people of God, and that it can show in how we live our lives. Because we care about people, we're able to do these things. Because we love our families, we will do what's necessary to provide for them, right? These are kind of very practical concepts that I want you to take in mind, and kind of maybe feel a sense of relief or joy that, this is not a standard that we need to meet, not all these individual tasks and check marks and, characteristics that we need to accomplish, but rather the core message is that out of our faith in God, our works can show who He is in a much better and wiser way. So I would definitely encourage you to explore this passage again. Read it for yourself, search it, compare it, do what you need to do to kind of dig through the truths of this, and let me know what you think. Am I completely wrong? Am I completely off? Or is there something that kind of gives you a sense of peace, knowing that this is in line with what is said in the Bible all the way through? If first you put your eyes and fix your eyes on Christ, everything else will follow. The outflow of love that God has provided for you flows into your community as well, into your neighbors. Instead of wondering, who is my neighbor, or who is the Good Samaritan, be the Good Samaritan, be the neighbor, be the good person, be the person that God wants you to be. And that is ultimately what I think Proverbs 31 is all about. And I am still wrestling with it. Every day I come to it, I may have a different interpretation, but I think that comes part with growing in your faith. You are allowed to wrestle. You're allowed to question. You're allowed to come to this passage with multiple understandings and kind of see where the core is, kind of see what the message is and what it says for you. And maybe you see something different every day you come to this passage, but just know that this passage is not an idol. You should not hold this to a pedestal and say, this is the standard by which all women should meet. Yes, it is. It is a standard for what women should be, but not for the ways that we think. So I hope this gives you a little insight into kind of a more in-depth take on Proverbs 31. And let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.